industry's a recent innovation. Music's been alive, thriving since cavemen. Folk songs so long have had a place in communities that you should be amazed at it. Then one day came intellectual property, meaning if I think a thought, you can't copy me. And if honesty's the best policy, I'd say songs are better off without this monopoly. It'd blatantly be a major fail if they patented the major scale. And downloads don't equate to sales, so taking...
Hello, and welcome to the Tech Dirt Podcast. As always, I'm Mike Masnick, back again with Dennis Yang and Hirsch Reddy. This week, according to the Association of Research Libraries, is Fair Use Week for 2015. So today, we're going to have a bit of a discussion on fair use, what it means and why it's important, and also how we can get it spread more widely. In 1976, the U.S. radically changed the way its copyright laws work by shifting from a formality system in which you needed to register to get a copyright to one where nearly every created work was automatically put under copyright for the life of the creator plus 50 years, later bumped up to life plus 70 years. At the time, some certainly recognized how massive a shift this would be, while others insisted that it was a minor change that would mean very little in the long run. As something of a concession to those who were worried, the 1976 Act also formalized what had previously been a common law concept of fair use, allowing people to make use of copyright-covered works in certain cases without it being considered infringement. Fair use is a hugely important but mostly misunderstood concept in copyright law, which can be seen quite clearly if you do a search on YouTube for the phrase, "no copyright infringement intended," a phrase that some believe creates a magical fair use shield around potentially infringing uses. In the United States, we are still one of the only countries that has a codified fair use concept. While many others have a concept known as fair dealing, it is generally much more narrow and defined in the law as to what qualifies. Fair use, unlike fair dealing, sets forth just some general principles of what should be fair. This includes things like criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research, and also includes the famous 4 factors test that courts often use to determine whether or not something is or is not fair use. This flexibility has both good and bad sides to it. It provides for flexibility that one hopes allows the courts to adjust with the times and with new forms of expression and new technologies, but it also creates tremendous uncertainty for creators who can't truly be sure that their use is fair until a court has weighed in. And that, of course, is a process that is too expensive for many to endure. In the meantime, other countries, including the UK and Australia, have both explored and mostly rejected attempts to create a fair use regime, arguing that without a stack of US-style case law to back it up, it would just lead to a litigation black hole for decades. Yet these days, the nature of expression has changed massively. Copyright, originally designed as an incentive for the professional creation of content, often feels quite out of place in an internet world where anyone is a creator and remixing, reusing, and recreating works is commonplace. We live in a world where retweeting, reposting, and reblogging are seen as good ways to share, but copyright law wasn't built for such a world. The Supreme Court has described fair use as a safety valve on the First Amendment, allowing copyright and free speech to coexist, though some of us feel that that safety valve needs to be vented much more broadly. At the same time, fair use is commonly referred to as a limitation and exception to copyright law, whereas I would argue that it should be seen as a key and fundamental part of free speech, to which copyright is the exception and limitation. So as we discussed this during Fair Use Week, I wanted to have a discussion about fair use, why it's important, and how it can be expanded. So Hirsch, Dennis, what can we do to make more people recognize the importance of fair use?
I think one of the things that people who are very religious about intellectual property rights, one of the things they tend to forget is that anything that you make, any advancement you do, whether it be in science, whether it be in art, it has to be built on something, right? Mm-hmm. It has to, you take components that have already existed, you take not just inspiration, but I mean, when I say components and building blocks, I mean, to some extent, you know, besides hip hop and all these things that are, you know, very clearly remixes,
right?
Even things like classical music, right? There's very formal building blocks. There's things that people see over and over again. when people don't have the freedom to use these building blocks, it becomes really hard to push the envelope to create new things. And we see these problems not just with things like music, but you see it even in engineering, right? Mm-hmm. If you have a what people call a thicket of patents, it becomes the intellectual property actually becomes something that holds back the space instead of actually encouraging it.
Well, I think
right?
To some extent, we talk about. I mean, everyone focuses on things like hip hop and reusing samples and things like that, but to an even greater extent, right? The whole concept of culture and shared culture, they're all building off of or making use of some common pieces. Music from the 50s, right, has a common feel to it. Artwork, that fits into a different, a certain classification, a style of artwork, right? It's because they're all building off of it. They're doing different things and they're being creative, but they're using some kind of common idea or component, and the concept of fair use, I think, is important in not just establishing that, but recognizing how important those shared elements are in culture, right?
And besides that, I mean, if you think about it, when people are having these arguments about how strong copyright law should be or how limited the fair use exception should be, generally it comes from a place of deep respect for the artist, or at least the industry of art. You could say, like, whether it be the recording industry or the movie industry, right? I mean, these are the people that go to Washington, D.C., and then the politicians get on a podium and they say, we need to make this legislation to make copyright stronger for the artists so that we have more content. But one of the things that, like, people forget is, like, if you look at the entire world, right, and the way people make content, let's say content in India, the film industry there, or music in China, right? Certainly copyright is not enforced the way it is in the United States, right? They are much more lax. You see people, singing songs on the internet, and very definitely it seems they're not compensating the original Chinese author of that song,
Right.
But people figure out ways to compensate the artists, and it's not like those societies don't have their own music and don't have their own film, right?
Yeah.
They have these vibrant industries. And so in the United States, when people get on stage and say, hey, look, we really need these really strong intellectual property protections, otherwise these industries are going to collapse, the argument just doesn't hold that much water. And if you look at it on the flip side, like fair use is just one portion of that.
Sure.
Right? Like eroding fair use is just one portion of that. Even with fair use, you could go even beyond that and say there's all kinds of other uses, things that are outside classical common law fair use that we might want to have. But there's no point even talking about those because fair use itself is constantly being constrained, So it's like you can't even get to the conversation about, like, hey, can we do stuff like people do in other countries? Well, that's not even on the table.
Yeah. Right. I mean, but what's that delicate balance that we're trying to achieve here?
Well, so if you go back,
Yeah.
As I mentioned in the opening, right, the Supreme Court has talked about fair use being sort of this, valve that protects the First Amendment, right? Because if you think, if you go even further back, right, if you think about it, technically you could make an argument, and some have, that copyright law violates the First Amendment, right? Because in a very, very real way, copyright law is a restriction on expression.
Right.
Now, copyright system defenders will say that doesn't count because it's expression that is infringing, and the First Amendment should only protect original expression. And I don't think that's necessarily...
Yeah, but that's not how the First Amendment is written.
Right, right. But there are different arguments there, right? So, the idea is that, fair use is supposed to allow for freedom of expression, even in cases where copyright-covered content is being used. And when you think about it that way, when you think about something that is protecting the First Amendment, I think that's pretty important, right? We believe pretty strongly in the First Amendment and the power and importance of freedom of expression.
Right.
And therefore, the role that fair use plays in expression and in creativity and in the arts is hugely important. and yet it doesn't really get that much attention, and people don't talk about it that much. And maybe maybe it's a branding problem, right? I mean, maybe people don't think about it just because it sounds legal and boring. But if you look at what so many people do on a daily basis, they rely on fair use.
But I think your point of, copyright being almost like the de facto standard that people approach kind of all content kind of is an exact example of almost like the perversion of this whole concept of like, we started with the First Amendment and all of a sudden yet everything we talk about is covered is automatically assumed to be covered under copyright, right? So is that what you're trying to say? Is that we need to flip that around?
Yeah,
as a
so
society?
I think, right, and this is where I have this problem with this idea, and it's very typical, and people on all sides of the argument refer to fair use as a limitation and exception to copyright law. And I think that's a mistake, right? I mean, I think fair use is a free speech right. It's about a user right, and copyright is a limitation and an exception on that. And we can argue about how strong copyright laws should be for that purpose, but I think we should be looking at freedom of expression and things like fair use as the standard.
Right, and copyright comes on top of it.
Look at the copyright in terms of where are we, restricting and holding back expression. And then we can have an argument about, is that legitimate and is it okay and where is it okay and under what conditions is it okay? And in that case, we're looking at a world in which we are viewing copyright for the sake of, when is it appropriate? When is it, serving a certain goal and purpose, as opposed to just assuming that all content needs copyright, and we're looking for exceptions where that content should be, be able to be used without having to get permission or to license the content.
If you really think about it, even before there was copyright law, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's think about something actually specifically that doesn't even have copyright protection, like news stories, right? If you break a story, that's like factual information. Right. Someone could.
The facts of the story are not covered by copyright.
Exactly.
The expression,
the story is though.
The writing, the specific expression around that story could be covered.
Exactly. The verbatim story that a reporter writes, that can't be copied. But the facts, you could read it and summarize it yourself, right? Well, back in the day, there were certain courts that created sort of judge-made law,
right,
around the notion. Well, you can't
called hot news.
Exactly.
Right.
The hot news. It was basically court-created rights, right? Around news,
which is technically still valid in New York.
Exactly.
But there's some fights about it.
So if you really think about it, like maybe that model of basically taking individual pieces of content and deciding, hey, is someone unjustly enriching themselves off of the backs of someone else,
right,
and giving rights only in those cases, that seems like a better way, an industry by industry way, and examining. That seems like a better way to me of protecting content than just this really broad thing where we just say, hey, everything is imbued with copyright and that's it, right? Because think about this. In such a world, something like a film, a song would probably get the kinds of protection we see already, right? Like judges would probably, I'm not saying that judges need to do that, but, having sort of looser rules where it's kind of like we have something that's broader that says something along the lines of, reproducing content created by someone else in a certain way, that is illegal, right? Like that enriches yourself, at their expense or reduces the market for their wear. Something like that might make more sense than basically saying, just blanket. Anytime you make anything on film and fix it on film, that's copyrighted. Because if you think about the way copyright laws are abused, and let's say someone wants to do a takedown notice against a video that criticizes some speech they made, right? Then they make this copyright claim on the portion of the speech that's made that's reproduced in the news report, right? And of course, that's very clearly fair use. Like the fair use statute, in fact, explicitly says for news reporting or criticism, you absolutely can reproduce a piece of content. Even in that case, just that threat of the litigation for somebody who's running an amateur news blog, that itself creates enough of a disincentive that will cow some people, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And And if you flipped it and you said most of the time videos don't have copyright, then I think it would be a little different. It would be much harder for someone to write a threatening letter to someone and say, hey.
Well, to some extent, right. I mean, you could go back to a different, if you went back to like the 1909 standard, which is where you had formalities, which is that you had to register to get the copyright. And then still anything that is, a new and unique work that is fixed, you could then register for the copyright. And then everything else is public domain. Then you don't even have to worry about fair use.
Well, I don't know if the registration step would change things today. And the reason is when people upload videos now to like YouTube and Vimeo, those kinds of websites could automatically put in a little checkbox that says, hey, do you want us to register this for you? And you could just register it.
But maybe that's okay, right? Because then it's still a choice, right? Whereas opposed to now, and like right now, so like, YouTube, and I assume Vimeo does this, but I don't even know. You have the option you could put a Creative Commons license on your YouTube video, and many people do that.
Does it default to the Creative Commons? Or
I don't believe it defaults to the Creative Commons.
See, that would be interesting.
Yeah, sure, that would be interesting, but,
Because it's almost like opt-in now.
Yeah.
It's opt-in to not have your random home video not be, copyrighted, which it seems a little silly to me. But
though it is weird that while they will offer you a Creative Commons license, they won't offer you the CC0, which will put it in the public domain. I don't know why they don't offer CC0, but that's, getting a little far away from
the fair use. But if you think about the specific enumerations that are in the legislation, right, for fair use, right? Like there's criticism, there's reporting, there's teaching, I think, there's research. There's specific things that are in there. Even for those things that are specifically called out, right, fair use comes under attack.
Yep.
Right?
So,
it seems ridiculous. It's in the legislation. So if you think about it, having something in law and actually having it in the real world sort of function in the way that people must have thought when the 1976 Act was being written, this is the way it should function because we've written it. Well, that's not really true. It really has to do with like who has a scarier lawyer, really, right? To some extent.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
And exactly. A really good example of that for people who don't follow this stuff as closely is like the education space, right? So education is listed. It's in the statute as a use that can be fair use, right? But there have been all sorts of lawsuits, and there's one going on right now with Georgia State over whether or not different handing out printouts and things like that are considered fair use, and that seems like something that is in the statute as fair use, and yet there's still this this need to go through this 4-factor analysis, and the rulings in that case so far have been massive because there's all different works, and the judges have to go through each of the works and determine whether or not they're fair use. And to some extent, you should just be able to point to the statute. It says, educational purposes are fair use, and these kinds of cases shouldn't happen. And even so all of us sitting around this table, we all went to college in the 90s, right? And in the middle of while we were at college, or basically right towards the end of while we were at college, there were all these lawsuits against print shops that would print out course packs. And as this copyright lawyer I know says, you can tell when someone went to college by asking them, basically how much they had to spend for course packs in college. And if they were, between $20 and $50, you went to college before these lawsuits. If they're like $200 or $300, you went to college after these lawsuits, which all came out basically as we were finishing up college. Mm-hmm. And the courts basically determined that even though that's for clearly educational purposes, course packs, what could be more educational, that they weren't considered fair use because there was a profit aspect to it, even though for-profit stuff can certainly be fair use.
Well, this brings up an interesting point. That's a little bit of a diversion from the fair use thing, but it really has to do with kind of the intentions of legislators, the intentions of actually the constituents, right, citizens of the United States, then goes through the lens of the legislators. They write a particular statute. In the case of this fair use provision, the fair use provision would say something like, here's some enumerated things like teaching, et cetera, that we
Right.
want fair use to apply to. And when a judge is making this decision, he should look at these 4 factors. And the 4 factors that he's supposed to look at are things like, what's the effect on the market for the copyrighted work, how much of the copyrighted work was reproduced in the Xerox copy, and a few things like that, and what is the purpose that it's being used for, obviously. So for something like teaching, you would think, okay, they're going to take only one poem out of an entire anthology of poems is going to be reproduced for an English class, so that's a very small portion, right? And it's only going to be circulated to, say, 20 students, not the entire university. And it's only going to be used specifically for teaching, and then the students are going to destroy the packet afterwards. They're not going to go out and sell it. Even in that situation, they say you can't use it, right? You can't use the poem. So really what people should ask, and judges should ask, is, on what circumstance can you use it for education? I mean, describe for me the situation in which the handout is not charged, right? And they really can't come up with one. So it basically negates the entire statute, right? But if you look at it the other way, which is to actually look at the way the legislation is looked, it actually looks very logical what the judges are doing, because it clearly says in the statute you have to look at what is the impact of giving these handouts out onto the market. And the publisher can make the argument that, hey, this poetry anthology only sells to college students, and none of them have been buying this anthology at all. And in that circumstance, you're like, okay, well, all a publisher really needs to do then to get paid on these handouts is to make sure that the anthologies they put out are so goddamn boring and don't appeal to anyone that the only person who gets them is students, right? And once you do that, the government will step in and make sure you have a market. Like, it's ridiculous, but that's the way it actually functions. And no one could have predicted that.
And I mean, that's a problem, but it's also just part of the nature of the statute itself, which is that, right, I mean, you have the sort of, enunciated things that are fair use, and then you have the 4 factors test, which are separate. And the way that you're supposed to judge the 4 factors is there is no thing. It just says you need to take these 4 things into effect. You can take other things into account also. You don't just have to take those 4 factors into account, and then you can weight them however you want. So it's not, there's no rule that says, like, if you meet 3 of the 4 criteria, you're automatically fair use. The judge can still weight, the different factors in different ways. And so it's, another lawyer I know once made the argument that you could take any case, any fair use case, and someone can make a perfectly reasonable argument under the law how it could go either way. And that is actually, I think, kind of dangerous, going back to the principles that we were talking about originally, about this idea of using it as a valve to protect free speech and the First Amendment. Because if any case that involves fair use can go either way, then every case has to go through a trial process, and you can't rely on fair use enough to feel protected to use it.
Some are more egregious than others.
Sure.
Right? And some are definitely going to pass the muster, I think. I think even under this very vague kind of definition that we have of fair use, even then there's certain things like when CNN shows something for 15 seconds on the screen and says, here's a video of a politician being ridiculous, you're going to get away with that. Daily Show, they're going to get away with that. No one's going to win that case. No one's going to bother filing that case.
Well,
let me put it to you this way. They're not going to bother to file that case against the Daily Show, because the Daily Show has their own lawyers. They might file it against
there was
Schmo.
just a case last week, okay, where Fox News lost because they used a photograph in commemorating 9/11, and they used somebody's photograph and they posted it to, I think, Twitter or Facebook or something, and they put a hashtag on it and something like that, and they lost, saying that wasn't fair use, because they said that they weren't using it in a transformative way, and therefore they lost because it wasn't transformative, even though it was. You could.
Was that even news reporting?
Well, that's right. So it opens up a question.
Twitter feed is kind of promotional, maybe.
Yeah, but it's still, doing some sort of, remembrance for 9/11 could be seen as reporting, right?
Twitter
Right.
reporting.
Okay, right. So I mean,
maybe the lawyer
there
in me is
are
coming out there.
there are arguments there, but but then think about it. If using a photograph in a Twitter feed is infringement, think about how much infringement is happening every second, right?
Well, I have a soft place in my heart for photographers because I think in this kind of very digitized web world, I think they kind of get the short end of the stick compared to people who make
Okay, but then I mean the pushback to that is they always got a really nice benefit, which is some have argued that photography shouldn't be subject to copyright law at all because what you're capturing with a photograph, unless you've especially if it's just an outdoor thing. The copyright technically covers like the framing and maybe the angle, but
I think you're diminishing. There's some we can all tell when there's a really good picture versus some crap somebody shot, right? Like,
yeah, but how much of the photograph deserves copyright protection?
So here let me separate two things. I think it's very difficult to take good photographs. Sure. On the other hand,
I'm not denying that.
Do we need to have like super strong copyright protection for people to get compensated? I don't know. That's much more. I take photos, right?
Yeah.
And I post a lot of photos, and my photos aren't very good. There's certainly people who are much, order of magnitudes, 2 orders of magnitude better. But it's very difficult to argue that what Ansel Adams does, right, is not worthy of copyright protection, that anyone should be able to reproduce his posters or photos. The man goes to Yosemite, camps out for a week, tries to get the moon in the exact right position with the exact right snowfall. That kind of stuff.
Right. And he has a copyright on that, and nobody's denying that. But, But there's a question of, in an age where everything is about sharing these works, right? So put Ansel Adams aside, right? And even take credit because, I've seen your photographs and they're pretty good, right? But if much better than you imply here. So if you take a great photograph and you post it to Facebook and then I share it on my feed, should that be fair use?
I'm fine with it because I don't make my living that way. But I can imagine.
Sure, but okay, go ahead.
So I'm on this photography subreddit. I think it's called R Photography. I can't remember the name, or maybe it's R Photographers. Regardless, and almost weekly there will be a thread of some sort of a photographer complaining how little he was offered to do a particular job, or how some photo that he took was really underbid by some news room or something like that. And really, when you look at why that's happening, it's happening because photography equipment has gotten very cheap. There is a huge volume of talented people willing to take photographs. And then there's a lot of people that are kind of like amateurs, and much better amateurs than me, with even much better equipment than I have, taking photographs and then just doing piecemeal kind of stuff.
And so then it's right. It just becomes supply and demand.
Exactly, right? And exactly. That's my point, which is that's eroding the value, maybe. But the problem is it gets a little murky here too, because let's even in the situations where the content is very good, right? Even with the situation where the content is very good, it's hard for particular photographers to monetize a photograph because they may not be able to find a way to get it out in sort of a controlled way because it's already been shared,
so, and this is, I don't want to diminish photographers because I love photography. I did photography for a while. I'm but you could also make an argument that it's difficult to monetize being a sculptor right now, right? Yeah. There are different forms of artwork that are not easy to monetize. That's not necessarily the job of copyright, right?
Yeah. No, I agree to some extent. You would have to, in a world without copyright, I suppose you'd have to figure out some way to get.
And you could and you can do other things. And I think also if you're a particularly good photographer and you can promote it, then you can sell future work and things like that, and being hired to do things and being commissioned. But we're getting a little far away from the point of the podcast, which is fair use. So we're also running out of time. So I want to kind of wrap this up and bring it all together, and we'll do some final thoughts. And I want to go back to the original question, which I don't think we actually ever really tackled, which is how do we get it so that fair use is more recognized and solid and widely used and relied upon?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's isn't that one of the points of it being Fair Use Week, is to have more
and that's why we're doing this
awareness.
podcast now.
I mean, that is I don't like. That's a question I would have for you. Is like, what should we all be doing like this week to really celebrate the fact that fair use should be the de facto standard and the starting point?
I think the Fair Use Week is exactly the kind of thing you need, right? Because this is really in the way our legislation works, the way our court system works, the way our law works, and all that stuff. Really, public opinion and the way judges are really influenced by that.
Yeah.
And so when people start feeling a particular way, that will change how the laws are applied.
So how do we? So what is there out there that will make more people recognize how important fair use is? Is it?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's getting to. I mean, TechDirt, the blog itself, still does not have a copyright claim at the bottom of the blog anymore, right? So
No.
And I think that the fact that C in a circle is is what everyone always assumes goes at the bottom of a website. Maybe that's actually
But I don't know
would
if
that be
that.
interesting? Is to come up with like, hey, for this week, everyone just really think about if you want to.
Well,
apply
but there are
copyright.
things like Creative Commons for that kind
Sure.
of thing. But I think getting more people to recognize how much fair use impacts their daily lives, and sort of going back to the point that you were making earlier, Hirsch, about things like The Daily Show, right? I mean, The Daily Show relies on fair use, and John Oliver relies on fair use.
Is it a matter of making, a day without fair use and try to watch The Daily Show without any of the clips?
I mean, that's an idea, right? I mean, things
if we could get John Oliver to actually agree to that would be amazing. 'Cause
Yeah.
his show's so popular. I think
do it.
to be honest, things.
either one, both of them.
I guess they both of them, yeah.
Yeah.
Things like when TechDirt names and shames somebody, when Ars Technica names and shames someone, when Reddit names and shames someone, these kinds of places where you get a thread where 50,000 people see it in a day, right? Those kinds of things raise awareness, and I actually think I'm not all doom and gloom about this. I actually think that if anything, fair use. Is going to get stronger in the future because for the first time I think there's a whole generation of people that are interested in doing Photoshop battles and remixing photos, remixing music,
Right.
taking videos and making their own edits and stuff like that. And they're not going to be quiet when they're in their late 20s and 30s. They're going to continue to see this kind of stuff, and they're going to be voters. And so I think things are going to get better in terms of fair use, not worse, regardless of how powerful the industries arrayed against it right now are.
All right. Well, I hope that you're right, and I will try and fight to make that possible and to make your prediction come true where I can. And I hope everyone else who's listening to this will do that as well. And I think we're going to be done for this podcast today. So go out and enjoy Fair Use Week and do something that's fair usable. All right. Thanks, guys.
He wasn't there, so let's go back to the start. Before 22, all music's in the public domain, so fuck you. It's never the amateurs that reckon it's damaging us. It's the major labels saying it's fatal, like when Napster had to pack a rip by Metallica. The tables turn now, the labels churn out a new Jezebel internet televangelist, and she's fit with a manuscript that was actually written by Mr. Michael Masnick. Can you get